My stepmother smirked, "You'll never get a cent." After she took over Dad's company. So I bought out her shareholders and voted her out in front of the entire board. Rain pelted the windshield like 1,000 tiny fists, drumming hard and relentless as I pulled up to the old family house. This place used to feel like a sanctuary, a place where I could breathe. But now, sitting there, engine still running, I felt a pang of dread, a sinking feeling that twisted tight around my gut. It had changed since Janet moved in, my dad's third wife and the woman who'd quietly taken over his life. I turned off the ignition and sat for a moment, my fingers resting on the steering wheel, watching the raindrops slide down in thin rivulets. The radio was on, low, murmuring voices I didn't care to listen to. I'd driven 2 hours, braving potholes and highway traffic, because it was my dad's birthday. And because I hadn't seen him, really seen him, in nearly 3 months, thanks to Janet's endless list of excuses. It was always, "Oh, your father's not up for visitors," or, "Celia, he needs his rest, we don't want to agitate him." But not today. Today, I wasn't leaving until I got to see him. I stepped out of the car and walked up the path, dampness clinging to my jeans and chilling me to the bone. I knocked, and after a moment, the door swung open, and there she was. Janet. Standing there in some sort of soft pink silk robe that looked more like lingerie than loungewear, she took me in, her eyes traveling over my rain-dampened jeans, my damp sweater, and my old boots. She pressed her lips into a tight smile that barely reached her eyes, the faintest twitch of annoyance tugging at the corners of her mouth. "Celia," she drawled, her voice dripping with fake warmth, "you didn't call ahead." "Didn't think I needed to," I replied, trying to keep my tone neutral. "Well," she said, glancing behind her as if she had some more important guest waiting in the wings, "it's just that, you know, your father isn't feeling his best. The doctors really insisted on him resting." "Janet," I cut her off, my patience fraying, "it's his birthday. And I drove 2 hours to be here." She blinked at me, then raised one perfectly manicured eyebrow. "We had a lovely breakfast this morning, actually," she said, that infuriatingly soft voice layered with condescension. "Just the two of us. He doesn't need much excitement right now." I could feel my jaw clench, every muscle tightening as I resisted the urge to push past her. "I think seeing his daughter is hardly going to send him into cardiac arrest," I said, trying to keep my tone steady. She shrugged, leaning against the doorframe, as if she had all the time in the world. "You know, Celia," she said, her voice lowering, "he really needs a calm environment. And I don't think you quite realize how delicate he's become." It was then that I noticed her hand resting on the doorframe, the glint of a new ring catching the dim light. A diamond. A big one. The anger that had simmered beneath the surface bubbled up, and I took a step forward, narrowing my eyes at her. "You're telling me you can't even wake him up for 5 minutes? Not even for a cup of coffee?" "Celia," she sighed as if I were being childish. "Your father needs his sleep more than anything. And frankly, I think you should understand that by now. You hardly took much interest in his well-being before." That hit like a slap, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Maybe you think I didn't care because you've been making all the decisions. But I've been here every step of the way. Every step, Janet. And he's my father." She laughed, a short, dismissive sound that made my blood boil. "Oh, please," she sneered. "You were perfectly content with that little art gallery of yours. Happy to stay on the sidelines while the real work got done. This isn't your playground, Celia. It's serious business. Your father built this company." "Yes," I snapped, cutting her off, "and I grew up in that company. I was there when it was still a 2-room office, when he was barely scraping together payroll, Janet." She tilted her head, her face softening, though her eyes remained cold. "But you weren't there recently, were you?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You didn't step in when things got rough. And when your father really needed someone, who was there?" "I was." "That's because you wormed your way in. Just like you're doing now." Her lips curled into a smirk. "Wormed my way in? Is that what you think? I've done more for that company in 6 months than you've done in your entire life. And for your father." "Please," I said, rolling my eyes, "you're only here because of his money. You think I don't see what you're doing?" She took a step closer, her eyes narrowing, her voice lowering until it was nothing more than a hiss. "You think I care about his money? Please. You have no idea what it takes to keep that company running. You've been prancing around your little gallery while I've been here doing the real work. And just so we're clear, Celia, you'll never get a cent from him as long as I'm around." Something inside me snapped. "Oh, I think that's a decision for my father, don't you?" She smiled, looking like a snake about to strike. "Your father trusts me with everything. Every decision, every signature, every contract. And you? You're just a distraction. A little girl who can't face the fact that she's irrelevant." That word, irrelevant, rang in my ears. The nerve. The gall of this woman, standing there in my mother's house, pretending she was some savior. I took a step back, catching my breath, fighting the urge to scream. "I'm not going anywhere," I said through gritted teeth. And I'm not going to let you bleed him dry. She let out a laugh, cold and calculated. Good luck with that, dear. I have everything I need right here. And trust me, there's nothing you can do about it. With that, she turned and walked away, the soft click of her heels echoing down the hallway. I stood there, fists clenched, every nerve in my body screaming for justice. I knew then that this wasn't going to end with a polite conversation. Janet had crossed a line. She was taking everything, little by little, from my father, from our family, from me. But she didn't know me well enough. Not yet. She'd only seen the Celia who was polite, who didn't rock the boat, who stayed in the background. She hadn't met the Celia who'd do whatever it took to protect her family's legacy. That side of me, the side she didn't believe existed, would be her undoing. I left that house with a plan brewing in my mind. I'd find out exactly what Janet had done to take control of the company. I'd figure out how she'd manipulated him, step by step, until she'd wrapped her claws around everything he'd ever worked for. And when I did, I'd make sure she had nowhere left to run. Because she'd taken over a kingdom that wasn't hers, and I was going to take it back, piece by piece, starting with the very thing she thought she'd locked down, the board. And when I was done, she'd have nothing left but the ashes of her schemes. As I drove back home, my mind was a torrent of anger and determination. I wasn't going to sit back and watch Janet steal everything my father had worked for. She thought she had the upper hand, but she didn't realize I had connections too, people who would help me because they loved my father, people who hadn't forgotten the man behind the company's name. The next day, I called up Mark Griffin, Dad's old business partner and his closest friend. Mark had been there from the start, back when they were young men with nothing but a dream and a second-hand photocopier. He'd retired years ago but still held a significant number of shares in the company. If anyone would know what Janet had been up to, it was Mark. Celia, I was wondering when you'd call, he said as soon as he picked up, a hint of sadness in his voice. Mark, I don't know what's going on, but Janet's taken over everything. She's made it impossible to see my father. I don't even know what condition he's really in, I said, feeling my voice shake. I'm sorry, Celia. I knew things were getting bad, but, well, I didn't think it was this far gone. I didn't want to interfere, he admitted. But you're right. I've seen what she's been doing. She's built quite the empire for herself, pushing people out left and right. Mark, I said, feeling a glimmer of hope, you still have influence on the board, right? He paused. Yes, I do. I still have my shares, and I know a few of the old guard who'd stand by your father. But we'd have to be careful. Janet has control. A lot of it. She's not the type to go down without a fight. That's fine with me, I replied, feeling a spark of fire. I'm done letting her walk all over us. Over the next few weeks, I worked with Mark and his contacts, meeting in coffee shops, over late-night calls, and in quiet conversations behind closed doors. Piece by piece, we put together what we needed. I found out that Janet had transferred more shares to herself than I'd realized, slowly consolidating her power over the past year, as if preparing for my father to be permanently out of the picture. But there were still enough shareholders who remembered my father, who wanted to see the company stay in his family. Finally, we had a plan. We would confront her directly, in the one place she thought she held all the power, the boardroom. The morning of the board meeting, I arrived at the company's headquarters early. Janet had called a meeting to announce new changes and likely further secure her control. She had no idea I would be there, ready to face her head on. As I walked into the boardroom, a wave of nostalgia hit me. My father's portrait hung at the back of the room, a constant reminder of his legacy. The room was already filling up with board members, some old friends and others newer faces who had little memory of my dad. But Mark was there, giving me a small nod as I took my seat. And soon, in walked Janet. She spotted me instantly, and her face went from surprise to a tight, controlled smile, a glimmer of malice in her eyes. Well, Celia, she said smoothly, I didn't realize you'd be joining us today. A bit out of your element, aren't you? On the contrary, I replied, meeting her gaze, I'm exactly where I belong. Her smile faltered slightly, but she recovered, turning to the board. I'm glad you're all here, she began, because today we're going to make some important changes that will ensure the continued growth of this company. It's been a challenging year, and with your support, I'm ready to take on an even more prominent role to lead us forward. I could see the board members shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Mark cleared his throat, and Janet glanced at him with a glint of irritation. If I may, he began, I think we need to address something before we proceed with any changes. He glanced at me, then back at Janet. We need to discuss Celia's concerns. Janet's face hardened. And what concerns are those? I took a deep breath, knowing this was my moment. My concerns about the way you've taken over my father's company, Janet. About how you've shut me out, manipulated my father, and built a power base here for yourself. And I know that you've been using his illness to consolidate your position. Janet scoffed. That's absurd. Your father asked me to take charge. He trusted me to look after things while he recovered. I've done everything for this company, far more than you ever did. Really? I challenged, standing up. Then why did you transfer shares to yourself behind his back? Silence filled the room. Janet's face went pale for a split second, but she quickly regained her composure. Celia, she said with feigned pity, you have no idea how business works, do you? Your father was in no state to make decisions, and the company needed a stable hand. I did what I had to. Stable? I shot back. You cut out the people who cared about him. People like Mark, who actually wanted to protect the company. All you did was take advantage of a sick man. The tension was thick enough to cut. Several board members were watching, their expressions a mix of discomfort and disbelief. I glanced at Mark, who gave me a small nod. It was time to bring out the last card. Luckily, Janet, I don't need your approval to be here, I said. Over the past few months, I've been talking to shareholders. People who remember what this company used to stand for, and as of this morning, I paused, watching her eyes widen as realization dawned, I've secured enough shares to hold a vote. A vote of no confidence in you. A murmur rippled through the room, and Janet's face contorted in anger. You can't do this. You don't know what you're talking about. You've never even cared about this company until now. You're right, I said, feeling the weight of the moment settle over me. I didn't care enough to get involved before. I trusted my dad to run things. But I do care about my family, about my father's legacy. And I'm not letting you steal that from us. She clenched her fists, her voice trembling with barely concealed rage. You little, spoiled brat. You have no idea what it takes to run a company. You think these people respect you? They're just indulging you because you're his daughter. Mark stood, clearing his throat again. Actually, Janet, many of us respect Celia a great deal. And we trust her to honor her father's legacy. A vote was held, and in less than 10 minutes, it was over. Janet had been removed from her position, her influence shattered. She looked around the room, stunned, her once smug smile now replaced by a cold fury. As the board members began to file out, Janet stormed up to me, her voice a low, venomous hiss. You think you've won, Celia? You think this little victory means anything? You're in way over your head. I met her gaze, feeling a calm satisfaction settle over me. You might be right, Janet, I said quietly, but at least I can live with myself. Can you? She scoffed and turned on her heel, storming out of the boardroom without looking back. I felt a strange sense of relief wash over me as I watched her go. The company wasn't just a business. It was my father's life's work, and now I had the chance to protect it in a way he couldn't. Maybe I wasn't a business mogul, maybe I had a lot to learn, but I knew one thing, I would do it my way, honoring the man who built it from the ground up. As I left the boardroom that day, Mark caught up with me, placing a supportive hand on my shoulder. Your dad would be proud, he said softly. And for the first time in months, I believed him. That was the end of Janet's reign. I took back control of my father's company, securing his legacy, and I finally had the chance to rebuild what she'd nearly destroyed. And as for Janet? Well, she never did come back, leaving her last traces of power in the dust of that boardroom.